Totalism. The group and or its teaching has relevance to every realm of life. Every facet of life should be seen through the lens of the group. All other systems are wrong or inadequate.
It is pretty totalistic, especially because it's literally taking over society right now.
Yeah. And it starts from the perspective of society is arbitrarily constructed, and the way that it's traditionally been constructed is oppressive. And so we've got to deconstruct and reform it in a way that is not. It's saying that all of our institutions are wrong and have been wrong. The media has fomented bigotry in the past. The government and its laws have enabled bigotry and hatred in the past. Churches, families, all of these things have. So we've got to tear down all of those different institutions and through revolution build up something that fits our vision of how things should be. So it requires this totalistic view of the way that the world should work.
Yeah, it does.
How does that rhetoric show up on the pages of Tumblr? It's so interesting that you mentioned Tumblr, because that seems to be the entry point for so many people is Tumblr. And I wonder if 5 years from now, we're going to hear that TikTok is perhaps the entry point for people more than Tumblr, just because of how media has changed.
How did we see totalism on Tumblr? It was probably more people thinking of ideas and how they would put them into practice in person. If it's just people coming up with ideas of how to integrate being transgender into society. I don't know, thinking about ideas for third spaces for bathrooms, or whether, obviously not everybody wants third spaces. Some people just think that everyone should either just be in the men's or the women's room.
It feels like there's a project to identify anything that could be interpreted as cis heteronormative and conforming to the binary, and problematizing it, calling it out, and transforming it. And so there was a period of time where if a book came out, if a movie came out, if some statement was made, if there was anything wrong with it, then it would be called out, and then an apology would be demanded, or there'd have to be some sort of change. And we saw that manifest by unisex bathrooms in some instances when that was identified. We're starting to see it where in children's television programming, if people could say in the past there hasn't been representation of non-binary people, we now have to insert those characters into children's programming or into movies and television shows. And all of this is responding to in the past where people have called out these things as problems. And I feel like there's a totalist element of that, in that there's no realm of society that's free from that. There's no realm where you can say, you know, what we have to say, what we believe doesn't really affect that. And we don't need to mess with that. And people are free to be or do however they want in that. It has to exist everywhere. And if it doesn't, that's room for you to move your activism into that realm.
And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, then the type of thing that you would see on Tumblr, it would be more like catchphrases like trans liberation now and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And what they mean by that is really it being something that's part of all of society, that's been integrated into all of society. That's what liberation would be. It'd be like unconditional acceptance of whatever the trans movement wanted at that time.
And it's interesting because just knowing about your story and the way that this is affecting so many other people, if it really was just something about you could choose to identify and live in society in a particular way, and society can accommodate that, and that's the only element, then it's an easier thing to conceptualize. But when it involves making irreversible decisions in young people that they may change or evolve on, and it's done in the setting where there's all these social pressures that tend to lead them into a particular pathway through the methods of undue influence that may go through medicine and surgery, then the stakes are just so much higher and the consequences are so much more real. That kind of justifies wanting to say we need to be very careful about how widely and widespread we implement all of this.
I agree, yeah.
Okay, so how do we want to rate the concept of totalism?
It's severe. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about is how earlier I was saying that, I think when we were talking about time control, I was talking about how even in detransition, I feel like transition still takes up all of my life, or the ideology still takes up all of my life. And even when I try and disconnect from it, it's in everything. It's in books, it's in the TV shows. It's if I go to the library, the librarian is wearing pronoun pins. just it's literally everywhere in every part of the world at this time. So yeah, that really does reinforce this idea that it is very totalistic. Yeah. So
All
severe.
right. Now, this one, totalist reframing. Situations, question, thoughts, or feelings are reinterpreted in ways that suit the goals of the organization. This is used to continually prove the ideology correct, to squelch doubts, and to silence outsiders.
Yes. One that I think about, and it's specifically about reframing. So when I first came out, or when I was first thinking about whether I was going to come out, starting questioning my gender, I reframed the context of my entire life basically
Mm.
around that narrative. And I think that's where the parallel is, that I don't know if people were necessarily encouraging me to do that. I think it was more that the narrative was there, and then I changed all of my experiences around it. So, for example, in childhood, I liked role playing. I liked just pretending, playing pretend. And a lot of the characters that I played were male. So when I looked back on that, I was like, oh, a lot of the characters that I played were male. That means that I was a boy the whole time. So that, for
Mm.
example, that would be one of the things. Or I didn't like wearing dresses. That means I was a boy the whole time. So there, it was just taking all of these different things that I thought were like proof, and then rearranging them all around this narrative that transgender is something that I could possibly be,
Mm.
and then moving forward with that. Yeah.
Did you see totalist reframing show up in any other ways?
As I saw that description right now, I'm reminded of, so the Tavistock has their JIDS department, Gender Identity Development Service, I think is what it is, which
Okay.
was announced that they're going to close it by next spring. And the reasoning was that the people who are looking into it didn't feel like it was a safe environment for the children. They didn't feel like it was, the care was holistic enough. They didn't feel like they were being followed up. The data wasn't being taken. And it was this one place, I think it's in London, and it was just the one place where everyone is being sent to. Is like one
Yeah.
centralized thing. And when I think about this, the reframing, I think about how when that information came out, everyone that is in the same network as me was celebrating, feeling like, oh, they're finally listening to us. They're trying to reform things. And
Mm.
the way that the activists took it was they took it like things were not being reformed. They're just being made more barrier free and better for
Mm.
them. So it was like they didn't really read. Hillary Cass is doing an independent review, so it's called the Cass Review, and she released like the interim review where all of these things are laid out, all of her concerns. And it's they didn't read that, and they only read that the centralized clinic is being shut down and it's being changed into multiple regional clinics. And so they were like,
Mm.
oh, we're just trying to get rid of the waiting list. They're making it easier for people to transition, essentially. And so that's what I think of when I think of that reframing. It's just, it's always a win for them
Yep.
somehow. And I've seen that with other things. I've seen that with court cases where it wasn't clear. They would win on some things, but lose on other things. And then both of our sides would be yelling at each other, being like, we won. No, we won. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that serves to bolster the faith of the faithful, and if they never go and read and try to get their own perspective on it, then that narrative fuels further activism. So, what do you think? Totalist reframing.
I think that's severe.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.